Okay, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, we've got as far as chapter 16, Llifen. And there is Llifen, sorry, which I've already shown you in the illustrations video, in color, no less. But in the book, as I said before, it's black and white. So here we go. Llifen. One of the main attractions about Llifen is that it is off the beaten track, and from the point of view of the fisherman, its relative inaccessibility is a big point in its favor. The countryside is quite unspoiled, and there are many who consider that it is the most beautiful and best of all the fishing resorts of the south of Chile. The photograph on page blank, alas, no photograph, will convey to the visitor some idea of the magnificent panorama which awaits him in Llifen. Well, I think the photo I found does that quite well, although it's not the original one, obviously. In order to get there, you have to leave the main line at La Unión station and proceed on a branch line to Lake Ranco station. From this point, you cross the lake by a small steamer to Llifen. The trip from La Unión station taking 4 hours, and the whole trip from Santiago 26 hours. And I have a note, I've added a footnote, by car on Panamericana Sur, Ruta 5, Route 5 on Pan American South Highway. Nowadays, it would take about 9.5 hours, according to Google Maps. As the branch line train and the steamer do not run every day throughout the season, it is just as well to make inquiries beforehand and avoid having to kick your heels for one whole day en route. However, Llifen now has a landing ground which makes travel easier for the air-minded. The hotel at Llifen is owned by a German and consists of a strong wooden building, a converted farmhouse with accommodation for 40 people. It is a simple place without even a sitting room, but the bedrooms have the great virtue of being clean and comfortable. The food is also simple, and a hot bath can be provided so that the fisherman has all that he wants in the way of comforts as a background for his fishing holiday. As the accommodation is limited, you have to book your rooms a long way ahead, and the months of January and February are, of course, the most popular. The main fishing is in the river Calcurupe, which links up Lake Puyehue and Lake Ranco, and the whole length of its course is 15 kilometers, 9.5 miles, which is fished generally in 2 days. The boats are sent up to the outlet of Lake Puyehue by ox cart, and the fishermen have to ride there, this being the only means of transport other than their own flat feet. At nightfall, the boats are left at the first stage, where the fishermen rejoin them the following day. In addition, there is the river Caonahue, C-A-O-N-A-H-U-E, maybe Caonahue, which runs into Lake Ranco at a point north of Llifen, and the river Nilahue and Rinilahue, which runs into the lake from a southeasterly direction and joins the lake at points south of Llifen. The trip to the river Rinilahue takes 3 hours by motorboat, and it is therefore only occasionally visited by the hotel visitors. The bars of the rivers Caonahue, Calcurupe, and Nilahue are the favorite resort of the fishermen, and as the maximum capacity of the hotel is only 40 people, there is plenty of room for everybody on the water. So these are bars as in near the mouth of the river, not drinking bars. The custom is for the fishermen to arrange with each other every evening where they will fish the next day so that there is no clashing. The choice of 3 rivers and 3 bars, considered in conjunction with the limited hotel accommodation, is the great attraction of the fishing at Llifen. Another attractive feature is that the trout in that region are almost entirely rainbows. In fact, it is stated that only 1 brown trout has been caught in the river Calcurupe up to the present. I must say, to look at, I far prefer the rainbow to the brown. It is reported that the fishing several years ago at Llifen was not up to its usual high standard, and the reason for this temporary setback gave local fishermen food for thought. As a result of an unusually mild spring, there was very little snow on the Cordillera, and the snow-fed rivers in that region suffered accordingly. The river Calcurupe is indirectly snow-fed, and the other three rivers which enter Lake Ranko are directly snow-fed. And as a consequence of the lack of snow, there was very little water in any of those rivers that year. This situation, aggravated by a spell of exceptionally hot and dry weather in the summer, which further reduced the water in the rivers and lakes in that region to a very low level, had the effect of increasing the temperature of the water considerably above normal. Frank Morrison, who used to spend his holiday there every year, informs me that the river Kalkuruppe, for instance, was so low that he was able to wade across in places where in previous seasons he would have been right out of his depth, and that the only fish he saw in the river were tiddlers, apart from one big fish which was hooked immediately above one of the deep pools but got away. It would seem obvious to me that under such conditions, the bigger fish would seek the cooler waters of the deep pools and the lake, and there was no reason to be alarmed as to the danger of anything beyond a seasonal setback. That the bigger fish were still in the neighborhood was shown by the fact that they could be seen clearly every day, feeding at the edge of the current in the bars of the rivers, and by several catches made during the following season. It is also reported that in the months of March and April, after the rains came, the fishing recovered a great deal, although it did not touch its customary high standard. A similar situation occurred during the past season owing to a long spell of drought. Excuse me while I attend to my cat. Right, that's that sorted out. On we go. In the year 1937, Frank Morrison caught a 13.5-pounder in the river Kalkuruppe on a fly. And during the 1941 season, he had the pleasure of catching a 12.5-pounder in the bar of the river. George Andrews tells me that in January 1945, a 15-pound rainbow was caught in the river Rinyanihue, there we are, Rinyanihue, of a fly. But he does not know who the fortunate angler was, nor can he furnish any particulars. Many fine catches have been made in the past in the Llifen district, and there will be many more in the future. If you are looking for a quiet fishing holiday away from the madding crowd with the modicum of comfort, Llifen is your haven, and you will enjoy it. In fact, I feel that this account does not do justice to Llifen, and that I have not made sufficient use of the superlative in describing its outstanding qualities as a fishing resort. I will be honest and admit that my knowledge of it is rather limited. And that's the end of chapter 16. Continuing now with chapter 17 on page 285 about Puyehue. I suppose these are all Indian names or something. They don't sound very Spanish. That's Puyehue River, which I've already shown you in the illustrations in color. And this photograph is courtesy of Bertie van Hensbergen, who obviously has been there. Thank you, Bertie. All right, the fame of Puyehue rightly lies in its hot mineral springs, which are of the first order. Legend tells us that in the days of the Spanish conquest, the son of the leading Araucanian Indian was taken prisoner after a grim battle, and that sometime later, when the commander of the Spanish forces was taken ill, the young Araucanian acted as his guide and took him to the springs, which cured his infirmity. The Spaniards took possession of the district and organized its defense with the construction of forts, which still exist on the shores of the lake. In the old days, despite the difficulties in the ways of traveling, many made sojourns to the curative waters. Now the mineral spring installation at Puyehue, according to the opinion of well-informed judges, compares favorably with the leading spas in any part of the world. And from what I have seen, I imagine it would be difficult to find better facilities anywhere. The old hotel was burned down in the year 1939, but on its ashes there has been built a modern luxury hotel costing the equivalent of more than $1 million American dollars. This is no small achievement when one considers that Puyehue is 84 kilometers, 52.5 miles, from Osorno, the nearest town, and it rather takes one's breath away to find, tucked away among the woods at the eastern end of the lake, a modern building with all the most up-to-date amenities such as central heating, air conditioning, cold storage chambers, and the like. It requires vision and courage to embark on an enterprise of such magnitude, which cannot possibly give any return on the capital invested for some considerable time, and which depends so largely on the future construction of roads and transport facilities generally in order to attract visitors. And the officials of the Banco de Chile responsible for this undertaking are to be congratulated on their achievement. On page blank is shown a photograph taken from the air of this magnificent building of stone and wood, Nordic in architectural style, which stands like a medieval castle amidst incredibly beautiful surroundings in the heart of the Chilean Lake District. The lover of nature will find a great deal to interest him in the lovely walks in the neighborhood, and those looking for recreation have the choice of several sports, aquatic and otherwise. I am told by winter sports experts that the skiing fields up the valley are of the highest order and will attract attention when transport facilities render them accessible. Looking from the hotel balcony, the view of the lake is very lovely. The whole picture, and especially the deep blue coloring of the lake in contrast with the rich green wooded hills, is reminiscent of the lochs in the Western Highlands of Scotland. Not infrequently, it rains quite steadily all day, covering the lake and the woods with mist, making the recollection even more vivid. It rains a lot in Scotland. At the eastern end of the lake, there are several attractive islands, the largest of which, Fresia, is owned by a family of refugees from Europe. It is said that after their distressing experiences, their one idea was to escape from civilization. And apart from the holiday season, when they are occasionally visited by parties from the hotel, they see practically nothing of the outside world at all. They receive no newspapers and have no wireless set, and I recall when I went over to the island in January 1942, they were unaware that the United States had been at war for over a month. They have some livestock, grow their own food, and appear to be quite contented. But I seem to be forgetting that this is a fishing book. The name Puyehue in Araucanian language, now we're getting an explanation, and I've put in a footnote here. The Araucanian languages are a small language family of indigenous languages of the Americas. There are about 200,000 Mapudungun speakers in central Chile and 40,000 in the Argentine. Huiliche is the native language of a few thousand Chileans. Okay, so the name Puyehue in Araucanian language means the land of fish, and there can be no doubt that the lake abounded with fish in the olden days. In fact, until the 1936-1937 summer, there were fish, pejere, trucha común, and peladillo, but no evidence of trout in the lake and adjoining rivers. But suddenly, in that particular season, the shores of the lake were strewn with hundreds of thousands of dead fish. Local inhabitants described the lake as looking white on account of the bellies of the countless dead fish floating on top of the water. The reason attributed to the wholesale disappearance of the fish was a volcanic eruption in the lake and rivers, a most feasible explanation. Indeed, there can hardly be any other to account for this major tragedy. From that time until a few years ago, there was no evidence whatsoever of fish life of any description above the Pilmaiquen Falls. When I first went to Puyehue in the year 1941, it was the general consensus of opinion that there were no fish in Lake Puyehue, nor in the river Golgol, Chanlelfu, Pescadero, and Nilque running into the lake, nor was there any sign of a crustacean or insect life in the lake, and the rivers and the lake were, should be were, shouldn't it? Sorry. Nor was there any sign of a crustacean or insect life in the lake and the rivers, and the lake was singularly devoid of birds. The river Chanlelfu, a few hundred yards away from the hotel, looked the most perfect trout water imaginable, although somewhat inaccessible on account of the trees, bushes, and ferns on its banks. And the river Golgol, the main river at the eastern end of the lake, was about 100 yards wide at the inlet to the lake and also looked good, especially further up on the way to the Argentine border. As soon as I got to Puyehue, I started making inquiries about the fishing and was informed by the hotel management in a vague way that the rivers had been stocked. Eventually, I found that the barman, Fernando, was a keen fisherman and that 6 months previously, he had personally stocked the Chanlelfu and the Pescadero with fry obtained by the local management from the Lautaro hatchery. I decided that on future visits, I would keep my ears and eyes open for the slightest indication of trout. Unfortunately, Fernando lost his job a few months later, and there was nobody left in Puyehue with any interest in fishing, which meant that information of a dependable nature was lacking. Persistent inquiries and observation brought no result until April 1943, when cormorants began to appear, and I found plenty of crabs, apancora, in the lake, and in a lesser degree in the river Llu. At this time, there were rumors about trout having been seen in the lake, but no reliable information. In December 1943, I returned to Puyehue, and this time I took a rod as I felt that 0 hour was approaching. On arrival, I had a talk with the local boatman who claimed to have caught a rainbow trout measuring about 18 inches in the river Llu. He said he had caught this fish at a time when workmen engaged on the construction of a bridge nearby were constantly throwing scraps of food in the river. He had used bait, fishing from the bridge with a hand line, and the description certainly fitted a rainbow trout. I asked him why he had not shown it to the manager of the hotel so as to have the catch and the identity of the fish established. He said he was afraid it might not be returned to him and he needed it for food for his family. There is no answer to that. The inevitable result was that I arranged to go out with him the next day, New Year's Day, for the whole day to fish the inlets of various streams and rivers to Lake Puyehue. The expedition was by boat, and an outboard motor enabled us to lose no time in getting from one point to another. From 9 in the morning until 5 in the afternoon, I fished constantly at the various bars and upstream as far as possible in each case, and did not see the slightest indication of a fish. I spent some time at the inlet of the river Golgol, a most imposing wide estuary, but there was no sign of anything. Nevertheless, there were gulls and cormorants around, quite a lot of them, and I was convinced that there must be fish too. During the last 3 hours of our expedition, it poured with rain, and by the time I got to the hotel, I had decided that as far as I was concerned, I did not care if there were any fish or not in the district, and had no intention of doing anything further about it. But it is wonderful what a hot bath, and especially in thermal water, and a whiskey and soda will do. Before dinner, I was planning the next day's attack. On the following morning, I walked down to the bridge on the river Llu, where the alleged trout had been caught, and spent some time casting into a fine pool at the bridge without the slightest touch or sign of anything. I then started on a run of about 60 yards immediately below the pool, and after a few casts, pulled out a small rainbow trout 9 inches long. I hated to have to keep it, but for identification purposes, the regulation had to be broken. I had a few more casts and got another small rainbow of the same size, which I put back. I was fishing with 1X gut and a small Peter Ross fly. Peter Ross fly, we have seen a photograph of that in the illustrations video. The rest of the story is easily told. I took the small rainbow back to the hotel and laid it for inspection on the manager's table. The various fishermen in the hotel, who did not even consider bringing fishing tackle to Puyehue, all had a look at it, and the important point was that the lie had been given to the idea that trout could not live in Puyehue waters on account of volcanic disturbances, as this small rainbow must have been there at least 2 years. The Department of Fisheries was advised by the hotel management, and later they sent a representative there to study the district and advise on the next season's stocking of the various rivers. Plans were made to start a hatchery in the vicinity of the hotel, which I am afraid have never materialized. I spent several other days fishing and took out and put back another small rainbow from the same run, but in no part of any river in the district did I see a fish. No other part of any river in the district did I see a fish. It certainly was not for want of trying. I came to the conclusion that there were few fish there, owing probably to the fact that the stocking was done in a small way. I can quite honestly say that no fish I have ever caught, not even that 14.5-pounder in the river San Pedro, gave me the same satisfaction as that small rainbow trout. And I believe that I shall always be able to say that I caught the first trout on a rod and line in one particular river in the south of Chile. In January 1947, I was invited to fly to Puyehue for the weekend with a party in an American Embassy DC-3. That's a Douglas DC-3, and I have a photograph of one there. Dakota, the old Dakota. I've flown in one once, quite a machine. And then there's another plane on this other side of the page. And I readily accepted the invitation as, in my opinion, that is the only way to travel to Puyehue. The trip took 3 hours as compared with a dusty and exhausting journey of 26 hours by train and bus, at the end of which one can hardly fail to be in the worst of bad humor. 2 years previously, I had the great pleasure of flying to Puyehue and all over the southern lakes with Sandy McDougall in the British Embassy plane. And I've got a footnote, Group Captain A, that'll be Alexander Sandy McDougall, was air attaché at the British Embassy, appointed on the 27th of November 1944, according to the Air Force list. And the British Embassy plane was a de Havilland Dragon, and this is a de Havilland Dragon Rapide here. And that was an unforgettable experience. You will have gathered that I like flying, but whether you are air-minded or not, I still think the only way to go to Puyehue is by air under present conditions, and the same applies to Pirihueco, the journey to which by land is equally tedious and exhausting. There is no doubt that the development of civil aviation is having a big effect on fishing and touring in the south of Chile. However, to come down to earth again, I went to Puyehue in January 1947 for a short weekend, 2 days, and did not think it worthwhile taking my fishing equipment, waders, etc. And did nevertheless stick a small box of trout flies in my pocket. On arrival, I was informed, and found it hard to believe, that 5-pound trout were being taken out of the river Chanlelfu, and that afternoon, Pancho Jones returned to the hotel with a 2-pound rainbow. In the late afternoon of the following day, Pancho lent me a rod, and off we went to the Chanlelfu, he with waders and a net, and I in sports clothes with only the rod. We arranged that we should keep a distance of about 150 yards apart, and if I should require the net, I had to shout and he would come along. I put on a Peter Ross trout fly, number 7, and started off fishing from the bank at a point where there was a drop of 3 feet to the water, and the water was at least 3 feet deep, clear as crystal and very inviting. On my third cast, a trout tried to take the fly and missed, so I waited a minute or two and then cast over the same spot. This time there was no mistake, and the battle was on. And what a battle. I was fishing very light, and that trout took me all over the river, but after about 20 minutes showed definite signs of tiring and came up a few yards from the bank. After a few final half-hearted runs, I finally got my fish close up and decided that the time had come for the net. I shouted and shouted, but apparently Pancho was out of earshot and nothing happened. A few minutes later, a small boy turned up on the bank beside me, and I offered him 20 pesos to go along and find Pancho. 10 minutes passed, and neither the small boy nor Pancho appeared. Another country lad on a horse came along, and I offered him 50 pesos with the same result. Still another joined me on the bank after an interval, and this time I raised the ante to 100 pesos. By this time, I had had the fish on for 45 minutes, and it looked dead, a beautiful 5-pound trout, according to my estimation. I could not bear the thought of losing the fish, but on the other hand, I did not like the idea of hanging on indefinitely. So after a few more minutes, and no sign of my third messenger, I decided to risk lifting the trout out of the water. Alas and alack a day, the cast, nylon, snapped in the middle, and my beautiful trout was lost. My readers will probably be amused at my story of the big fish that got away from me, but no matter, the story must be told. I have lost many fish before and since, but suffice it to say that I have never lost a fish which meant more to me than that 5-pound brown trout, which would have been a catch worthwhile in view of the background of the years when I looked so often at that lovely water and fished it without any encouragement, almost convinced about the theory that volcanic properties in the bed of the river made it impossible for fish to survive. Almost, but not actually convinced, right? And he was right not to be convinced. That is the story of one of the most interesting and at the same time disappointing fishing problems in this country. It is satisfactory that Fernando's efforts to restock the waters of Puyehue have met with some success, but it is not enough. The Chilean government holds the key to the rapid restocking of the lake and rivers if a fish ladder were built at the Pilmaiquen Falls. When the new hydroelectric plant, which is situated at the falls, was under construction and the falls were dry several years ago, determined efforts were made by fishermen to persuade the government to build a fish ladder, but it was not done and a golden opportunity was lost. Perhaps it may still be possible at some future date. The latest information received from Puyehue is that fishing there is improving year by year, but there are few facilities and the angler has to make his own arrangements mostly. There is no doubt that the future possibilities are very good. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 17 on Puyehue. And we're really quite close to the end now. The final chapter is chapter 20, and then there is a short postscript, very short. So thank you again for staying with this and listening to me, to my reading, and I'll see you again soon for perhaps the final time. Muchas gracias.